Dr. Laura Woodworth-Ney is Executive Vice President and Provost at Idaho State University. Go ISU. Yes, go Bengals. Previously, she served as Provost and Vice President for Academic Affairs and Associate Vice President for Academic Affairs. Woodworth-Ney's former administrative appointments at ISU include Chair of the Department of History and Co-Director of Women's Studies. She also served on the ISU Faculty Senate, both as a senator and as an elected member of the Faculty Senate Executive Committee. Woodworth-Ney is an active national speaker on topics in higher education and the humanities. She has authored more than 30 articles, book reviews, and scholarly essays, as well as 3 books and several co-authored. She earned her bachelor's degree in English from the University of Idaho and a PhD in American History and Public History from Washington State University. Let's give her a round of applause.
Thank you, Brandy. It's so fun to see former students doing so well and working in the field of history. And I have several of those here today, which means that I have been doing this a long time. But before I get started, I want to recognize Tara Rowe, who is here. And she did a lot of the preliminary research that made this presentation possible. So I just wanted to recognize her before we get started with that. It really is a pleasure to get to talk to you about Idaho women's suffrage because this is an understudied topic. Of all of the states that passed suffrage early, prior to the national amendment, Idaho is the least studied of those. And that became very apparent to me recently because I had to revisit this topic in preparing for the talk tonight. I'm a full-time administrator, as you heard, so I don't teach anymore. I actually have not been in the classroom for 10 years. And so I had to do some research to get up to speed on this topic. And I thought I would find all kinds of new stuff out there about Idaho suffrage that had not been published when I was working on these topics. And unfortunately, that is not what I found. I did not find enough new things. So I'll talk a little bit about that as we go forward. I do want you to think about, being a graduate student and imagine yourself in a library and your goal is to find out everything you can about Idaho women's suffrage. And we're going to walk through what that looks like. So these are Idaho's founding histories. Pretty much every one that we had in the special collections at Idaho State University. So I pulled them all just to see what do they say. And Tara had done this for me years ago, but I did it for myself not too long ago to see what did they say about women's suffrage. They were written about the same time that women's suffrage was approved in the state of Idaho. So you'd think they would say quite a bit about it. Only one of them says anything at all. And that is Hiram French's study, The History of Idaho. This is a multi-volume, very detailed, and I'm sorry to say, laborious text about Idaho and every man who ever did anything at all for the first couple decades of Idaho's history. But we do have a chapter about women in this textbook. In this text. You can see it there, 29, Women of Idaho, Equal Suffrage, the Columbian Club, Women's Clubs, and a Tribute. These are the things that he thought mattered about women in Idaho history, because this is it. This is all we get in the multi-volume study. And this is what he has to say about women's suffrage in Idaho. The history of equal suffrage in Idaho does not disclose a long, determined struggle, such as characterizes this movement in eastern states and other nations. So he's slamming women from the start here. This right was given to the women of Idaho with comparatively little urging on their part. Probably the untrammeled spirit of the West was a dominating factor. And then he wraps up this bit about the women who didn't really have to work very hard to get suffrage in Idaho with a tribute. Now, you'd think the tribute in the women's chapter would be about women. Or maybe it would be about a suffrage activist. But no. It is actually about John Haley, who is an important figure in Idaho history, and there's no doubt about that. The town of Haley is named after John Haley. However, it seems odd that this is the tribute at the end of the suffrage chapter. And basically he just says, this chapter may fittingly close with the words of a man who is qualified to speak of the women of the West. So that brings us to where we are today. Still very little scholarship about Idaho women and Idaho suffrage, frankly. So tonight we're going to talk a little bit about what do we know about Idaho suffrage and why Idaho? Why is Idaho the 4th state to approve suffrage for women? What made Idaho different? Or is this just part of a Western movement that is not different? Is Idaho unique or not? So my advisor, we clearly have a generational thing happening here because my undergraduate advisor, Kathy Aiken, has recently written about this topic, and this is what she said. The success of the women's suffrage amendment in Idaho was more the result of efficient grassroots organization and the vagaries of Idaho politics than it was male egalitarianism. So she's essentially contradicting Hiram French here, more than 100 years later. And Rebecca Mead, who's recently written probably the most comprehensive book about Western suffrage, essentially says the same thing. That Western suffrage in general, not just Idaho suffrage, but all Western states, because as we know, Western states passed suffrage before the rest of the country, was the result of unsettled state politics, complex Western race relations, and really interesting alliances between farmer populists and progressive reformers. So really what we have here is a unique convergence of opportunity that women activists took advantage of. And I love these sashes with the hats because when I talk about the activists, I can see you guys, and I love that. Because they would have said that they were taking advantage of these unique opportunities that they could see coming together. So yes, suffrage is the result of this political environment, but it's also the result of pragmatism and opportunism, and most importantly, women's political activism. We have some significant influences happening here that make this possible. And I'm going to talk about 3 of those. An emergent club women's movement in Idaho. Now, I don't want to downplay the fact that women's club movements in this time period are about white elite women. This is not, suffrage in Idaho and elsewhere is not a movement to expand the vote for anyone other than white, middle class, or elite women, period. So I don't want to send that message. But the club women should not be overlooked as an important force for political activism and egalitarianism in our political system. What they did, even if they didn't always do it for the reasons that we would want necessarily, did expand the franchise, did expand women's opportunity. And I am here because of these women. And many of us who have had opportunities in institutions, universities, and politics are here because of them as well. I want to talk a little bit about populism and free silver and its importance in Idaho politics in the late 19th century. We're in a time in US history right now where populism is again a topic, and we're certainly talking about that nationally. It was very much a topic in the late 19th century when women's suffrage is passed in Idaho. And then there are some linkages here that are important as well to national movements. The national women's suffrage movements were involved in Idaho's effort. So let's talk about irrigation and settlement. Now, some of you who know that my area of interest is irrigation history are probably groaning right now because I can tie irrigation settlement to anything in Idaho. So here we go. Suffrage is, in my view, essentially an expansion of what's happening in the late 19th century in the Western US. This is a period of time when the federal government is expanding its hold, certainly in the post-Civil War period, on this what it viewed, and many people did as well, the vast wasteland between the East and California that was going to be hard to hold from a diplomatic perspective, and certainly hard to hold because it has an insurgent population from the federal government's perspective, otherwise known as Native American tribes, who are being consistently and systematically wiped out in this time period. It's going to be hard to hold because no white Americans live there. So what do they do about this? The federal government passes a series of pieces of legislation to get people to live where we are right now. And a lot of those are irrigation, homesteading laws that allow for wide-scale irrigation in federally supported irrigation efforts in western places like Boise, like the Magic Valley, and other settlement regions. This is part of a larger movement of settlement that includes, of course, the Oregon Trail. It includes the formation of territorial governments, and you can see here Idaho's territorial boundary shifting over time. And homestead acts, like the Desert Land Act in 1877 and the Carey Act in 1894, which is really only successful in Idaho. It's successful in Idaho because the Carey Act projects didn't do well elsewhere. But Twin Falls, the irrigation projects around Twin Falls are all Carey Act projects, and they are the most successful Carey Act projects in the country. Most irrigation projects are not successful until the federal government intervenes with significant funding after the Reclamation Act of 1902. But this is really the argument that irrigation proponents are making, and you can see that in this map here, that there are all kinds of problems with overpopulation and poverty in humid America, as they call it. It is humid there, actually. And everything is great in arid America, where the sun shines all the time, it never rains, and if you could just get a handle on irrigation, you could do anything. You didn't have to worry, it didn't matter. You can water your crops without rain. This is a revolutionary concept. This is like the dot-com thing of the day. So the point is, we've got to depopulate the East, populate the West, and fix this problem that we have, that we don't have any white people living in places like Idaho. And as part of that comes a perspective of homesteading that we have today. You know, if you think about pioneer efforts, and my great-grandparents were pioneers on both sides, we have this image of pioneering in our heads that is very positive. This is not a negative portrayal. This is intentional because it is a marketing effort in the late 19th century to make homesteading and pioneers look good. It's a really successful marketing effort because we still think of it this way. And a good example is Corner's really important painting here of the Madonna of the Prairie. The pioneer woman is the civilizer. She comes to civilize these formerly uncivilized territories. And as part of that, there is a piece of this that suggests that pioneer women should be able to vote. So I'm going to link this back to our topic here. And that's very clear in the founding of some of these early irrigation communities, like New Plymouth Colony, Idaho. This is a utopian colony. Now, some of you might live in New Plymouth. Anybody from here? Well, it's just the coolest place because it's still, you can still see the horseshoe. It was founded by William Smith, who was this big-time irrigation guru guy. And the point was that the pioneers would come from professional life. These were not farmers. These were professional people who were convinced that homesteading was the future. So they left their desk jobs to move to New Plymouth, Idaho, to launch this utopian community based on irrigation. And the point was that they were going to create a new Eden in the irrigated West. And part of that was that white women, the white settlers that came with them, would have more power and more authority. So we do have a baseline here happening where white women in particular, white female pioneers in these new areas had more political power than their sisters did in other places. There are some other issues going on here as well, and that is that the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the WTCU, is very active throughout the 19th century, throughout the country, North America. This particular photo, Lips That Touch Liquor Shall Not Touch Ours, is a Canadian organization, a Canadian chapter. But the WTCU is active also in Boise and throughout Idaho Territory. Founded as early as 1883 in Boise, as a matter of fact. And the WTCU supported suffrage. And they supported suffrage because they believed that the way to get temperance was to give women the right to vote. So let's talk about Idaho's amendment. In 1890, when Idaho's Constitutional Convention chose not to give women the right to vote, there were no active women's suffrage organizations in Idaho. There was a WTCU chapter, as I mentioned, and there were probably 20 WCTU chapters throughout the state. But they were controversial because, to be honest, a lot of mining communities didn't really like the idea of outlawing drink. But we do have some female activists working in the state. One of those is Abigail Scott Dunaway. Many of you will know who she is. She's probably the most prominent female activist from this time period operating in the Pacific Northwest. She founded a suffrage newspaper, the New Northwest, and she's talking about these issues in her newspaper as well as in romanticized novels that she writes about the status of women. And one of those is Edna and John, A Romance of Idaho Flat, which is not a very positive view of the status of women in Idaho Territory. She says, "What a pity it is that a man who is idle or dissipated can ever be the sole arbiter of the destiny of woman whom he holds by virtue, not of his own good conduct and her desire, but through a fiction of the law which compels her to obey them in spite of her innate selfhood. Surely there is a wrong somewhere." She's very active in Idaho. Mostly she's active in Oregon and Washington, but also in Idaho. So she's influential between 1890 and the passage of Idaho's amendment. And then we, of course, have some other political things happening, too, after statehood in 1890. As I mentioned before, one of the big ones is the movement known as populism, which advocated for free silver, essentially a move away from the gold standard. Why would that matter to Idaho residents? Because we have big silver mines, so this is a great deal for silver mining. What about farmers? Do farmers support this move away from the gold standard? Why? Yep. Because it creates a situation where farming debt is less problematic, essentially. So they want to go to the silver standard because it creates a better economic environment for agriculture. So the miners and the farmers like populism because of free silver. In Idaho, that's everybody. That's pretty much the state. Republicans tended not to be in favor of free silver nationally, but Idaho's Republicans are in favor of free silver. And what's important about this is that every party is in Idaho that's operational is in favor of free silver and populism because of free silver, and the populists advocated for women's suffrage. And then we have some national movements using the western states as a test case. Wyoming is the first state to grant suffrage, followed by Utah and Colorado, and then Idaho. And the national suffrage organizations are looking at the West as a place to test their theory about how do we get this passed elsewhere? How do we get urban voters to support suffrage? Because urban voters are a problem for suffrage activists. They tend not to vote for suffrage. They want saloons, for example, to stay open in general, speaking generally now. And so there are some national efforts to intervene here to try to figure out how to get this to work in other states. One of those is the National American Women's Suffrage Association, which had been recently formed by the combination of two suffrage organizations that had previously been rivalries. And they sent Emma Smith DeVoe to Idaho in the summer of 1895 to make this case on behalf of the Women's Suffrage Association. They tell Abigail Scott Duniway to stay home because they think she's not very politically diplomatic. They're afraid that she's going to alienate the Christian temperance people, and that she will come across as abrasive to male voters. So that should sound familiar. The Idaho Equal Suffrage Association's tenets, and you can see that they are founded in 1895 with help from national organizations. This is the four tenets of the Idaho Equal Suffrage Association. The enfranchisement of women is in exact accord with the basic principles of a republic. All people are created equal. Women are taxed. Therefore, they should share in the privileges of government. Essentially the Tea Party idea, of course. It is necessary to enfranchise the women of Idaho in order to place them upon a political plane equal to that upon which the Indians of the state now stand. So now we get into a little bit more complicated story. And the Idaho State Constitution provides that Chinese born in the United States may vote, and thus Chinese the political superiors of native-born American women. So the argument that Idaho suffragist activists are making is essentially to their husbands and to political leaders, you allow other races to vote, but not your wives. I think it's instructive to look at what happens in the in the 1896 US election because it tells us a lot about how voters are thinking. William Jennings Bryan was the Democrat populist candidate, and he wins essentially in a landslide. Huge voting turnout percentage for him in Idaho. 78% of the electorate voted for Jennings Bryan. That's more than voted for Trump in Idaho in the last election, to give you an idea of how big this landslide is. SJR2, the women's right to suffrage, appeared on that ballot as well, November 3rd, 1896, and the results were 65.87% in the yes, that was 12,000 votes, and 34% voted no, 6,200. Suffrage is successful in almost every county in the state, with just a couple of exceptions. Mormon communities supported suffrage in big numbers. And part of that was because of a disenfranchised tradition that the US had of disenfranchising Mormon voters. So Mormon communities are supporting suffrage for Mormons across the board, including white Mormon women. Agricultural communities supported suffrage, and mining communities, for the most part, did as well. So how did they do it? And my argument is that they did do it. This is the women voting. This is the women making the vote possible. It's not men deciding that the untrammeled spirit of the West needs to make this happen. And when we look at the Idaho suffrage minutes, they talk about what are we going to do at the polls? How are we going to draw attention to us? Because the suffrage amendment had appeared on a previous ballot, and the idea was that it was lost in the shuffle, that people didn't know what it was. They didn't understand it. So women are out there talking about what this is and why you should vote for it at the polls. We also recommend that coffee and sandwiches be served near the polls. This to give the ladies an easier chance to approach the voters on the amendment question. Here's a sandwich. Don't forget to vote for women's suffrage. Any and all devices should be made use of to serve the purpose of calling the attention of the voters. All devices. I don't know exactly what that meant, but this umbrella is actually from a little later, but it's pretty great, I think. And it gives you an idea of the kinds of things. They're wearing sashes, they're clothed. There was some conversation, maybe we should show up without clothing. Well, that might be counterproductive. It's clear that other states and other suffrage organizations viewed this effort as really the effort of the women themselves. When we look at the correspondence from the time period, this is from the state secretary for the Women's Suffrage Association in Helena, Montana, writing to the women of Idaho to say, we admire you, we look to you as guides for our own suffrage efforts, and we need your help. So it gives us an idea that certainly surrounding state organizations viewed the Idaho women as having a big role in getting suffrage passed here. So Idaho's unique politics play a role. Mormon communities supported suffrage, as I mentioned. Settlement irrigation communities did as well for white women. Mining communities supported free silver and populism, and therefore suffrage by extension. And the racial dynamics are different than they are in the eastern part of the US and the South. We already saw a little bit about that. Women's suffragists are able to say, you've given Chinese people the right to vote and native-born American Indians the right to vote. Why not white women? Not that different than what the suffrage organizations in the South are saying. This is Austin's suffrage association, Austin, Texas. Won't you help us make Texas white? And this is, the suffrage maps always showed women's suffrage states as white, and the suffrage organizations are using that, of course, as a marketing effort. If you give white women the right to vote and you maintain Jim Crow laws in the South, you'll expand the white vote, essentially. So what does our student find out? If she goes back to what happens to women's rights in Idaho prior to the amendment nationally and after women's suffrage in Idaho. So there's this period of time, about 15 years, where women in Idaho have the right to vote and they don't have the right to vote elsewhere. As I mentioned before, there are a number of projects that are founded in this time period. These are all settlement irrigation projects. This is the settlement irrigation map of about 1916. And it doesn't look that different than the suffrage map. These projects are all in those states, except New Mexico, of course, does not grant suffrage, largely due to racial concerns there until the national amendment. And what this means is that women that come to these new settlement regions do have unprecedented political power. They vote in elections, they can sit on school boards, they can serve in many cases on juries. And the result is that they exercise that power in various ways. Women's clubs in particular on these irrigated settlement communities, irrigated settlement projects, exercise all kinds of efforts, including, and the WCTU would like this, including making a lot of these communities dry. The Reclamation era communities are almost all dry. In Rupert, Idaho, which is my hometown, and a reclamation community, sidewalk spitting was illegal. Public bathrooms were a reform effort advanced by women's clubs. Because if you think about it, if you go to town and you need to use the restroom and there isn't one and there are no trees, then this is not a good situation for white women. And in the process of advancing public restrooms, they also outlawed the use of the public for men. They outlawed, men had to use the public restroom as well. So if you think about what was it like before the public restroom, these women are having some say in how these communities manage civic responsibility. One of these women was Elizabeth Leighton DeMary. She created one of the women's clubs in Boise, and then she and her husband moved to Rupert after it became a reclamation settlement town, and she founds the Rupert Culture Club. And the Rupert Culture Club had a lot of power. It's the club that's outlining all of these things in Rupert, and also advocating for kindergarten, for preschool education, for parks, for I know that should sound familiar too. Daycare as well, for a different reason. For women and families who didn't have any option but to work. So they're advancing a number of progressive reforms in this time period. And here she is. This is Elizabeth DeMary. And here is the Culture Club in 1915. They are dressed in suffrage attire. Annie Pike Greenwood, many of you know as well, was a pioneer on a Carry Act project in Hazelton, Idaho, and she also is politically active. She's not a women's club member in the same way that the women's club members were, but she's advancing a number of reforms. She's a school teacher. Many of you know the school off the freeway in the Greenwood district that was her school. She's advancing reforms in her area for mental illness, for health care, for educational opportunities for women. And here's the Greenwood School recently. And she wrote in her very, I think, wonderful book, We Sagebrush Folks, about the status of women on these projects. This is about one of her neighbors. She recovered enough to enjoy sitting there, clean, well-fed, but she yearned not at all for the tar paper shack, her 5 children, or her husband. This is after she went to the Blackfoot institution for, at the time, known as the Institution for the Insane, and Greenwood was instrumental in providing the funding for that institution. She also talked a lot about whether or not the vote had made a difference in how women were perceived. And her argument was that it would take many generations for the vote to have that kind of generational impact, because the previous generations were influenced by what had come before. So the argument was it could be 100 years or more. So here we are today. And I think she's right in that the presidential election in 2020 will almost certainly not result in a female president. She did not find homesteading to be a fulfilling avocation, and was happy when the family lost the farm. Essentially, well, I mean, in the sense that she didn't have to do the farm labor anymore. And I'll just end here with a close-up of the women of the Rupert Culture Club. In summary, it's really activist women who make the votes for Idaho possible, the votes for Idaho women possible. And it's time that we had a reassessment of that. I have several students in the room, as you already know, and it's time that one of them write the book about this definitively. So I'll just drop that hint and take any questions that you might have.
Let's give Laura a round of applause.